To our couple weeks ago, we had our scheduled outreach, the church at the park, and then last week we were blessed with missionary David Green to Taiwan, and really enjoyed his teaching right there in Philippians 2, where we have been studying the last couple months on our Sunday morning service. And so it really hit home with me, and I know from some of your testimonies that you were blessed by that as well. But we had to take a break from our 1 Corinthians 13, and so here we are back at it. And I thought a good way for us to get back on track, to understand where we are and what we're doing, is to just read the context that we have already studied just a little bit of. So grab your Bibles, go to 1 Corinthians chapter 13. While you turn there, I'll give you the context that led up to the chapter 13. And really, 1 Corinthians 12 is the reason 1 Corinthians 13 was written, or at least it led to that point. And so 1 Corinthians 12 is all about spiritual gifts. And the church in Corinth was gifted but not spiritual. That was the name of a sermon I heard one time that really helped me categorize what was going on there in Corinth. They were Christians. They were saved by Jesus, and they were sanctified, and so don't get me wrong, it's a church and they loved God, but they were having some really immature problems. They were fighting over whose favorite preacher was better. There was so much division. There was racism. There was a class hierarchy within the church. Poor people were less revered than rich people, and all kinds of just baby stuff. And Paul is writing really 1 Corinthians as a massive rebuke. And as he gets to chapter 12, he points out one of the big problems that was going on. A very immature church is focused more on their personal abilities, their personal gifts, their personal ministries. And people were lifted up with pride if they had the gift of tongues, and people would covet other people's giftings and other people's abilities in the church. And Paul just shakes his head. This is so immature. This isn't the way church ought to be. We're to strive together for the faith of the gospel. If my brother in my church is gifted, I ought to celebrate that, not be jealous of it. I ought to be excited that I get to be a part of a body that has a body member or a body part that is useful, that can edify me and my other brothers and sisters, that can go into the world and preach the gospel. And so Paul is saying, look, I'm not demeaning these gifts. I just need to point out to you that we are all one body. So there's not one body part that's more valuable than another. If the ear says to the eye, since I can't see, I'm of no use. And it's not true. It's just that God has given us diversities of gifts, and God has set all of us together for the edification of the whole, so that the whole body can be healthy and striving together, so that the body could be personally healthy and go out there and be useful in the world. And that was the point of the gifts. That was the whole thing. But people were jealous. They were disappointed if they weren't gifted. They were prideful if they were. And Paul says in verse 31 of chapter 12, but covet earnestly the best gifts, and yet show I unto you a more excellent way. You know what's more important than speaking in tongues, Corinthian church? You know what's more important than all these gifts is love. I think many Christians in 2020, as we've been observing, have forgotten the more excellent way. And they've gotten so political, they've gotten so upset, they've gotten so bent out of shape about everything that's going on. And I'll tell you, churches are having division right now. Christians are tearing one another down. They are fighting and bickering. And as we learned today, they're doing things that are not becoming of love. They're not becoming of the one that we serve. If you add all of their actions up, you'd say, you know what, that just doesn't add up to what Christ did. That doesn't add up to the demeanor, the attitude, the mission of the church that we ought to be expressing. And Paul is writing to the Corinthian church, and honestly, in a lot of ways, this applies a lot to the American church, or the modern church, maybe we would say. And so I hope that we can learn a little bit. So that's the context, is they're all into their gifts, and Paul's like, I would rather you be spiritual than gifted. And praise the Lord for gifts, but here's the more excellent way. Just love each other. Learn how to love God and love one another, and everything else falls into place. So let's read 1 Corinthians 13, 1 through 5, which is to the point that we're at. Though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels and have not charity, I am become as sounding brass or a tinkling cymbal. And though I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries, like Daniel and Ezekiel and Jeremiah, and have all knowledge, and though I have all faith so that I could remove mountains, and have not charity, I am nothing. And though I bestow, so the classical sacrifices that you think of, the world might think of when you say charity, would be like donating to feed the poor or whatever. And he says in verse 3, and though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, though I give my body to be burned, and have not charity, it profiteth me nothing. And then in verse 4, he begins a several verses long description or definition of what agape is. Remember, we learned that agape was not a common word used for love. They used phileo. They used, I can't remember the other one. It was a fleshly, attraction sort of love, which off the top of my head, for some reason, I can't remember the name of it. But agape was something of a new term coined by the apostles, because to describe the love that God had for them, that Jesus displayed before them, the words that they had didn't seem to fit. They didn't seem to do it justice. And so they started using the word agape more than anybody else in prior Greek literature had ever used. And they started using it in ways that it hadn't been used before. Agape, they started using the word agape because they needed a word that could stand in the place to talk about the love of God. And so here in 1 Corinthians 13, starting in verse 4, he starts fleshing out. So what is agape, Paul? Well, charity, agape, suffereth long. It is going to last even through hard times, and is kind. There's a certain demeanor, a gentle characteristic about agape, that even though it's power, it's got power, and even though a person may be very, very strong and wise and all these things, but if they love, there's going to be a sense of kindness. You don't have to fear approaching them with questions. They're gracious toward you. Charity envieth not. This concept of envy that we studied is that I might view somebody else's success and not just want that success for myself, but want that success stripped from them and to watch them fail in the area that they had succeeded in. It's more directed toward the person who has achieved rather than the achievement. And charity is not looking at other people and their success or their victories or their rewards and saying, I wish they didn't get that. They don't deserve such a thing. That's not love. What else isn't love? What is love not, Paul? Well, charity vaunteth not itself. That has to do with the language of pride. Charity doesn't vaunt itself, doesn't lift itself up above those that it loves or anybody else. If I'm a loving person, I'm not going to always be praising myself and lifting myself up and talking about other people in a way that lowers their esteem in the eyes of others. And related to that, he said, here's another thing that agape isn't. Agape isn't something that's puffed up. And that was the definition, was to make natural or to inflate, to make reality look Make yourself look bigger than reality, larger than life, to inflate, to make it look like or appear that whatever this facade is that you're putting on is really not a facade. It's just natural. This is, so it'd be like if you did a good thing or you did something well, you could kind of act like, well, I always do stuff like that. I'm just that kind of person. I'm just naturally that gifted, that powerful, that wonderful. And so that is the idea of puffing yourself up. It's inflating your ego, inflating yourself in the presence of others. That's not love. And then we get to verse 5, which is the subject of our lesson tonight and our conversation in our fellowship groups. And it says, doth not behave itself unseemly. If you're wondering what love is, you have to know what love is not. And one of the markers of what love is not is it's not going to behave itself unseemly. Now, let's just break up the word just a little bit. We're going to get a definition. We're going to flesh it out. Then we're going to talk about it. He says it has to do with behavior. So this is an action. It's not so much about your profession. And notice it comes on the heels of vaunteth not itself, which is the profession, but then it says it's not puffed up, which has to do with the lifestyle, the actions of love. And then right after that, it says it doesn't behave unseemly, which is very related to vaunteth or to puffing up. Okay, behaving unseemly. Let's look at this. The Greek word is askimoneo, which is only used 2 times in the whole Bible, which many of these words in 1 Corinthians 13 to describe love, not only is agape something of a new term in the New Testament, Paul is using kind of rare language in order to describe it. And this is another example of using rare language to describe agape. He's trying to get them to think deeply about it. He's using words that probably was not in everybody's vocabulary. He's very educated. Matthew didn't use this word. Peter didn't use this word. John didn't use this word. Paul throws in this word, askimoneo. Love does not behave itself unseemly. And here's the definition for that word: to act unbecomingly. To act or live, to have your actions in such a way that is not becoming of whatever it is that you're trying to become of. So we've talked about this before, but we need to identify, what does it mean becoming of or unbecoming of? Well, let's break down the word unbecoming. Un is not, be, a state of being, and then coming is future fruition, something in the future, okay? So not the state of being present, what the future would expect the present to look like, okay? In other words, if you've got a goal to be a certain maturity, or if your goal is to be one who loves, then your behavior is going to add up in the present to whatever it will be in the future. We think of trajectory would be a great word to help us understand this, the word trajectory. So if I shoot an arrow and we take a picture of it mid-shot, you can look at where it came from and where it currently is in the picture, and then you can pretty much trace the trajectory pretty accurately to where it will end up going. If the target is the bullseye, and we take the picture at 25% from where I am and at the bullseye, the question is that arrow becoming of a good shot? Did I release this shot in a way that is becoming of hitting the target? So a couple of examples to get us on board with love does not behave itself unseemly, or love with the goal of being loving does not act in ways that don't add up to being loving. In other words, it's not just the words, I love you, it's actually living in a way that's consistent with that goal of showing love to God, of showing love to my neighbor. If I say I love God, but I do not keep his commandments, he says, if you love me, keep my commandments. So I might say I love God, but what does the trajectory of my lifestyle right now prove about my statement? Does it prove that I am becoming of what my goal is? Or does it prove that I'm unbecoming, that I'm behaving unseemly? The guy says he loves God, but he's behaving unseemly. His lifestyle does not add up to what he professes. Here's an example. A student, if all goes according to plan, will one day pass his final exams and graduate. So the future fruition or the goal of a student's maturation is to become educated, right? At least that's always been the goal in my understanding of education. But if by the time the senior in high school takes their final exams, that student doesn't know anything, can't add 2 plus 2, then it's unbecoming, it's unseemly. You should have been on a trajectory. Your goal was to graduate, but if you didn't do the things that become of high school graduates, then you're behaving unseemly. You didn't do what was necessary to accomplish the goal. Another example, a husband vows his love to his wife on his wedding day. The words were easy to say, marriage was sweet, but as the years passed, he showed less and less evidence that what he professed at the marriage altar was accurate in his life. He claimed his love was strong enough to last till death do us part, but his affair at work and his coldness to his wife do not add up toward that commitment goal. One more example. A teenage girl is friends with a girl she grew up with in the neighborhood. They played together as kids, they share their hearts with each other, they claim to be best friends, kind of like Jonathan and David in the Old Testament, a beautiful, loving friendship relationship. But when one girl finds a place among the popular kids at school, And then her friend approaches her at the lunch table. She acts like she doesn't even know her childhood friend. Though she intends to apologize and deal with it later on, her actions are not becoming of her profession of love and friendship with her friend. An example, though all men should offend thee, should be offended because of thee, yet will I never be offended. Those were the words of Peter just prior to Jesus dying on the cross. He professes his commitment and loyalty to Jesus. He loved Jesus so much. Jesus said unto him, verily I say unto thee, that this night, before the cock crow, thou shalt deny me thrice. Later on it says, so when they had dined, Jesus saith to Simon Peter, Simon, son of Jonas, lovest thou me more than these? Peter's words did not match his actions. He professed loving loyalty to Christ, but instead he ran. He behaved himself unseemly in his love for Jesus. And cutting right to the heart of Peter's inconsistency, Jesus simply asks, Simon, son of Jonas, lovest thou me more than these? It was not a question of courage. It was not a question necessarily of loyalty. It was a question of love. Isn't that interesting? Peter denies Jesus in public, even though he professed in private that he would never deny Jesus. And Jesus understands that the heart of that was a lack of true love. And he says, Simon, son of Jonas, lovest thou me more than these? Asked him that 3 times. You can tell if something is unseemly or unbecoming by looking at what the end goal of maturity is, comparing it to the present state, and evaluating if the actions of the present add up. My goal for Carson, Elliot, Adelaide, and Felicity is for them to become disciples of Christ who are mature and functional. And so if I am able to look at them presently, right now, there's time between now and whatever we release them into the world. 18 years old is a general number. We'll stick with Carson for now. Carson is 6, going on 7, and he is going to, Lord willing, mature into a disciple of Christ that is independent and functional and healthy and mature. And so I can look at his life now and say, is what his life producing right now becoming of the goal? That is one way to tell if something is acting unseemly or unbecoming of the goal. So what are some common ways we behave unseemly in our relationships? This is a question I want the fellowship groups to start discussing. Just some practical outworkings of behaving unseemly, of a gap in our love when we don't behave as becomes people who love one another or people who love God. What are ways where we can point out, look, there's an inconsistency in our love when this happens, when that happens, when we do these things? I'm going to give you a couple common ways we behave unseemly in relationships to start the conversation. But then in your fellowship groups, I want you to discuss other ways. Maybe you've expressed or experienced a lack of love. Though a person maybe professed to love you or you profess to love someone else, you notice that your actions weren't really adding up to what you professed. Here's one. Having relational titles without performing relational functions. It's a common thing where sometimes people want a title, but they don't want to do the work that the title implies. Maybe a person has always dreamed of being a teacher. They wanted to have a desk, a classroom full of children and a blackboard and be all dressed up like a teacher and have the function and title of a teacher. But then when they become a teacher, they realize, hey, this is actually really hard work. I don't know if I wanted to do the work of the teacher as much as I just wanted to be a teacher. Or maybe a father has this picturesque understanding or view of being a father, and it looks good on their life resume, and it just seems like the American dream that you're supposed to, as a man, just one day become a father. But then you realize that it's more than just a title and a name. You actually have responsibility. A lot of dads want to have the title dad, but they don't want to do the work or the function of a dad. And that is one way that our love is lacking a lot of times, where we like the title of best friend or husband or church member, and what these relationship titles that should reveal or should imply that we love the people we're relating to. I love my wife. I love my kids. I love my church. But sometimes we like to have those titles. It feels fulfilling, it feels natural, it feels like what we should be doing, but we don't want to do the work or do the actions that become of those titles. Do your actions say, I love you, or just your words? Having these titles without performing the functions. Just because you hold the title husband, wife, father, mother, brother, sister, friend, or church member doesn't mean you're living in love with which as those roles imply. I don't just want to have the title, I want to prove I'm worthy of the title, to prove that I actually am a father. Not just by title, but by action, by life, by loving my children. I am living as becomes of that title. Matthew 15:8, Jesus struggled with this concept. Even God struggled because Jesus is just quoting the Lord in the Old Testament. He says, "This people draweth nigh unto me with their mouth, and honoreth me with their lips, but their heart is far from me." It doesn't add up. Though they say they love me, though they say they follow me, their lifestyle is not matching that. Okay, so that is one common way we behave unseemly in relationships. Here's another one. Being hesitant to identify with those we love in public. I'm just pointing out just three actually today, three ways that we behave unseemly sometimes, or that we've noticed, and it's a common way. There are so many other ways, and I'm sure that you guys can come up with some others, but this one is being hesitant to identify with those we love in public. Have you ever, and I've done this before, especially when I was a younger Christian and I was a little less mature, and I remember, in private or with other Christians wanting to pray for my food. But if I was all by myself in a public space where there were others around, you do the old, you drop the fork on the floor. You're just thankful for amen. You pray before you get back up. In other words, you're bold and you express love to God in private or among people who also love God. But when it comes to being in public, you're a little bit ashamed of expressing that love. Have you ever been caught off guard by someone that you're close to who is treating you differently in public than they do in private? That reveals, or that is unbecoming of a loving relationship. Maybe an older sibling has a great relationship with a younger sibling, but when they're in public, the older sibling treats the younger like he's a nuisance. Maybe a fellow church member sees you at a restaurant with some of your friends, and they come over to greet you, but you're a little embarrassed to show too much of a relational bond. The third common way that we behave unseemly in our love is lacking in grace and empathy. And I'll warn you ahead of time, this one's a pet peeve of mine. Not that I've never done it myself, but when I see it, it bothers me. And it's a pet peeve, and I don't like it when I see this. Maybe you've noticed it as well. It bothers me so much when couples lack grace and empathy with one another in public. Maybe the wife is telling a story about a camping trip they took years ago with their kids. She says, it was a beautiful spring day when, and the husband interrupts, no, it wasn't. It was the middle of summer. I almost sweated to death. Spring. I don't know how you come up with these things. The wife says, dear, it was spring break for the kids. That's why we went. Husband might say, honey, it was summer break. Wife says, well, anyways, little Johnny was 7 years old and it was his first camp out. And the husband, nope, hold it right there. He was 8 and it wasn't his first camp out. You just weren't there for the first one because you're never around. And on they go. And maybe I exaggerated a little bit, but not showing grace or empathy toward the ones that we claim to love is one way that I think we are not adding up. We're behaving unseemly. This takes on many forms, but the big problem is that if love beareth all things, suffereth long, is kind, and endureth all things, then it doesn't add up to love if you're constantly correcting and abasing those you love. Romans 14:19 says, let us therefore follow after things which make for peace, and things wherewith one may edify another. Do your actions add up to your professions? You say you love God. Does your life back that up? Do your actions back that up? You say you love your kids. Does your actions prove that to be true? And this is the concept. Love doesn't just profess. Love lives. Love is an action. Love takes active roles in participating and in being in a trajectory of accomplishing the goal of love. Pastor Paul Chappell, commenting on that verse I just quoted, Romans 14:19, he said this: "It is smart to pick your friends, but not to pieces." I like that. It's smart to pick your friends, but not to pieces. You say you love your friend, but if you added up your actions, do they equal charity? You say you love God, but if you added up your actions, do they equal charity? John 14:15 says, "If you love me, keep my commandments." I hope that this has been a challenge to you, and I hope that we can now go into our fellowship groups and love one another, both in word and in deed. And let's make a part of our discussion that we discuss, okay, so what are some ways that we see in our world people behaving unseemly? They say they love, but this doesn't add up. It just doesn't add up when Christians act like this. Also, not just our love in relationships around us, like man to man, but also man to God. Where does it not add up in our relationship with God? Though we say we love him, this doesn't add up. So let's talk about that. And I hope you guys have a wonderful time with your fellowship group. Let's pray. Lord, thank you so much for always being honest and open and public with your love for us.